In the early 2nd century AD, along the freezing, mist-shrouded frontier of northern Britain, an entire Roman legion marched into the Highlands and simply ceased to exist. The damp, heavy fog of the Scottish moors seemingly swallowed the rhythmic, disciplined thud of 5,000 hobnailed boots, leaving behind nothing but an enduring and terrifying void. For a military apparatus that meticulously documented its campaigns, daily logistics, and even its most humiliating defeats, the fate of Legio IX Hispana represents a profound historical anomaly. The 9th Spanish Legion was not a unit of untested recruits. They were a premier heavy infantry force of the imperial government, holding a distinguished combat record that spanned from the provinces of Hispania to the Rhine frontier. Stationed at the extreme northern edge of the known world, operating out of the stone fortress of Eboracum, they were the iron fist of Rome in Britain. Yet, sometime between 108 and 120 AD, these elite veterans were permanently struck from the imperial registry. There was no recorded final battle, no grand monument dedicated to the fallen, and no recovered eagle standard paraded back into the capital. They were met instead with a deliberate, systemic administrative blackout, a cold silence from the Senate and the provincial administration that was far more chilling than any official casualty list. Welcome back to World Chronicles. Today, we break down the grim tactical realities of the Caledonian frontier, examining the severe geographical constraints and the asymmetric warfare that systematically dismantled a premier Roman fighting force. We will explore how rigid military doctrine shattered against an unforgiving landscape. What geographical trap and tactical nightmare could completely swallow 5,000 armored veterans without leaving a single mass grave behind? The Roman footprint in Britannia was always a calculated, bleeding wound on the imperial balance sheet. Since Emperor Claudius initiated the conquest in 43 AD, the island had consumed vast amounts of manpower and silver, while offering little strategic revenue in return. Maintaining a garrison of tens of thousands of regular troops across the channel required a constant, precarious pipeline of grain and coin. By the turn of the 2nd century, the provincial administration had consolidated control over the relatively tamed southern territories, establishing a fragile network of roads, administrative centers, and tax-paying settlements. However, the imperial government's grip ended abruptly at the stone walls of the legionary fortress of Eboracum, modern-day York. This massive fortification was not just a military base, it was the psychological and physical edge of the known world, projecting Roman authority into an untamed frontier. Garrisoning this vital choke point was Legio IX Hispana. They were not green recruits needing to be blooded. The 9th possessed a formidable, centuries-old pedigree, having served as the brutal enforcers of imperial will across the Mediterranean. They had fought in the harsh campaigns of Hispania, secured the freezing Rhine frontier against Germanic incursions, and systematically crushed the massive, bloody Boudiccan revolt decades earlier in Britannia. In the cold calculus of Roman military doctrine, the 9th functioned as a highly efficient machine designed to build roads, suppress dissent, and annihilate organized resistance through the relentless application of heavy infantry. Armed with the short gladius and the heavy pilum, they were the ultimate expression of linear warfare, engineered to break opposing armies in pitched, open combat. Yet, the operational environment immediately beyond Eboracum defied standard Roman pacification strategies. To the north lay Caledonia, a jagged, fractured landscape that actively resisted the very concept of classical civilization. The terrain transitioned violently from rolling hills into a hostile expanse of deep peat bogs, dense, impenetrable pine forests, and steep ravines. Here, The relentless, driving rain of the Highlands transformed potential supply routes into impassable quagmires, effectively breaking the sophisticated logistical models that allowed a Roman legion to project force. An army that required hundreds of supply carts and cleared roads to function was inherently disadvantaged in a landscape that offered neither. The indigenous tribes inhabiting this region did not build grand capitals to be besieged, nor did they assemble in open plains where rigid cohort formations could overlap their flanks and crush them. For years, the Ninth Legion had projected a perimeter of intimidation, enforcing an uneasy stalemate along the borderlands. The men of the Hispana believed their imposing stone fortresses, cleared timber lines, and iron discipline had finally pacified the island's violent northern reaches. But this confidence was built on a fatal misunderstanding of the frontier. The true threat was not mobilizing in a neighboring state. It was quietly waiting in a landscape where traditional Roman engineering and rigid military doctrine could not save them. A Roman legion was an industrial mechanism of war, comprising roughly 5,000 men divided meticulously into cohorts and centuries. On a flat plain, they were a devastating, impenetrable block of overlapping shields and disciplined iron. Their primary battlefield doctrine relied on the synchronized volley of the heavy pilum, a specialized javelin designed to puncture and weigh down enemy shields, followed immediately by the systematic, close-quarters application of the short sword, the gladius. This brutal efficiency, however, required rigid, linear formations. Every single infantryman possessed a specific geographic slot within the shield wall. To break the line or lose alignment was to invite structural collapse. This military doctrine had been perfected for fighting concentrated, static armies across the Mediterranean basin, where decisive, pitched battles routinely settled the fate of entire kingdoms in a single afternoon. Yet, this heavy infantry juggernaut carried an immense, paralyzing vulnerability: its logistical tether. To sustain 5,000 heavily armored regular troops, alongside their necessary auxiliary support and draft animals, required a staggering influx of calories, hundreds of tons of grain, and fodder moving continuously along the rear echelons. They depended absolutely on a secure network of cleared roads, navigable rivers, and fortified supply depots. The Roman military apparatus was fundamentally designed to march directly to an enemy's political center, lay siege to its capital, and force a rapid, definitive capitulation. North of the frontier, there were no capitals to besiege and no centralized state to decapitate. The Caledonian irregulars operated on an entirely different paradigm of warfare, one that rendered Roman strategic objectives obsolete. These indigenous warriors were not a unified, standing army, but a highly decentralized coalition of northern tribes perfectly adapted to their hostile environment. They relied exclusively on asymmetric tactics, utilizing their intimate knowledge of the fractured terrain to nullify the Roman structural advantages. They fought predominantly as light skirmishers, unburdened by heavy armor or massive supply trains, surviving off the harsh land and striking with localized numerical superiority. When the Ninth Legion pushed into the Highlands, they found their rigid formations actively weaponized against them. The dense pine forests, steep ravines, and sucking bogs stripped the Romans of their lateral mobility, forcing the heavy infantry into long, narrow marching columns that stretched dangerously for miles. In such constricted spaces, a sentry could not deploy into its defensive lines. The Caledonian irregulars recognized this fatal geometric flaw immediately. They strictly refused to mass for a conventional engagement, opting instead for a relentless campaign of hit-and-run harassment. They would loose volleys of light spears from the elevated tree lines, the sudden, sharp whistle of incoming projectiles cutting through the damp air, offering the only warning before the attackers vanished seamlessly back into the dense undergrowth. The senior officers of the Ninth had been trained at the highest levels to conquer rival empires by identifying and crushing the enemy's center of gravity. But as their extended marching columns continuously bogged down in the trackless, unforgiving damp of the Highlands, the grim, unyielding reality of their operational theater finally materialized. The Roman military apparatus was built to decapitate organized states, but in the north, they were fighting the terrain itself, an invisible, grinding war of attrition. They were fundamentally unequipped to win. Around 108 AD, the fragile stability of the northern frontier violently unraveled. Archaeological evidence from this period reveals a sudden, systemic pattern of destruction across Roman outposts stretching toward the Scottish lowlands. Auxiliary forts were burned to the ground, and localized garrisons were overrun before they could relay distress signals back to the provincial administration. This was not a series of isolated raids for cattle or plunder. It was a coordinated, decentralized insurrection. The Caledonian tribes had recognized that the Roman footprint was stretched to its absolute limit and sought to collapse the northern defensive network entirely. For the imperial government, ignoring this escalation was not a tactical option. Roman geopolitical strategy relied absolutely on the projection of overwhelming, inevitable retaliation to keep its conquered territories subdued. Faced with a collapsing frontier, the commander of Legio IX Hispana issued the Mobilization order. The decision to march the entire legion out of the fortress at Eboracum was born of standard military doctrine, not hubris. A punitive expedition was the textbook Roman response to a provincial uprising. Locate the insurrection, apply overwhelming heavy infantry pressure, and execute a decisive pacification campaign. The legionaries packed their marching gear, strapping roughly 60 pounds of iron, grain rations, and entrenching tools to their shoulders. The rhythmic, metallic clatter of overlapping armor plates and the heavy groaning of wooden supply carts echoed off the stone walls of Eboracum as 5,000 veteran soldiers assembled into their marching columns. They were a self-contained city of war, carrying the tools to build forts, bridge rivers, and crush any tribal coalition foolish enough to stand before them. The massive column pressed northward, utilizing the established Roman road network to maintain a rapid, disciplined pace. For the first few days, the march proceeded according to strict imperial logistics. Supply lines remained tethered to Eboracum, and the heavy infantry cohorts maintained their tight, rigid formations, confident in their structural invulnerability. But as the legion pushed deeper into the hostile geography of the Caledonian frontier, the paved roads began to degrade into muddy, uneven tracks, and the familiar markers of Roman engineering gradually disappeared from the landscape. The vanguard of the Ninth was deliberately leaving the secure infrastructure of the province behind, aiming to strike the tribal heartland directly. However, the fundamental flaw of the expedition lay not in the quality of the troops, but in the environment they were aggressively penetrating. As the miles of lumbering supply wagons crested the final line of mapped, defensible hills, the column essentially severed its own logistical anchor. When the 5,000 men of the 9th Legion marched beyond the last Roman watchtower, they stepped completely off the imperial map and straight into an environmental trap from which there would be no return. The Roman war machine required continuous momentum to survive, but in Caledonia, momentum died in the mud. Heavy, relentless rainfall saturated the ground, rapidly turning the primitive Highland trails into deep, sucking quagmires. The vital baggage train, consisting of hundreds of wooden carts loaded with grain, tents, and engineering equipment, immediately bogged down. Oxen struggled in the traces, and timber axles snapped under the immense strain of the waterlogged earth. To keep the expedition moving, the legionaries were repeatedly forced to break their marching rhythm, ordered by their centurions to manually drag the heavy wagons through the mire. This mechanical friction destroyed the tight spacing of the Roman advance. It rapidly expanded the physical distance between the vanguard and the rearguard, stretching the 5,000-man column over miles of hostile, broken territory and completely severing visual contact between the separated cohorts. As the logistical tail fractured, the physical condition of the heavy infantry began to critically degrade. Roman legionaries were equipped with heavy iron armor, highly effective at deflecting the slashing swords of pitched combat, but actively detrimental in the sub-freezing, perpetually damp conditions of the Scottish Highlands. The wet metal functioned as a thermal sink, drawing body heat directly away from the soldiers' core. Combined with shrinking daily rations caused by the stalled supply wagons, the men were forced to operate under a severe calorie deficit. Hypothermia, trench foot, and profound exhaustion began to thin the ranks before a single enemy blade was drawn. The environment itself was executing a ruthless campaign of attrition, systematically stripping the Roman infantry of their stamina and tactical discipline. Compounding this environmental misery was the constant, invisible pressure applied by Caledonian scouts. The indigenous tribes maintained their strict refusal to mass for a conventional engagement. Instead, they utilized the dense rolling mist and the thick pine forests to shadow the fragmented Roman column. Small warbands launched localized, highly coordinated skirmishing attacks against the exposed supply lines and isolated stragglers. A sudden, lethal volley of light spears would strike the marching line from the tree cover, and the attackers would instantly melt back into the gray fog before the Romans could form a defensive perimeter or launch a coordinated countercharge. This asymmetric harassment denied the legionaries any opportunity for secure rest, forcing the entire miles-long column to remain in a paralyzing state of high alert that rapidly drained their remaining psychological reserves. Driven by the urgent tactical necessity to secure a defensible position and clear the oppressive woodland, the Roman commander pushed his exhausted vanguard forward, desperately seeking high ground or an open plain where the cohorts could finally consolidate their lines. Instead, the degrading topography funneled the scattered column directly into the steep, uneven contours of a highland defile. The terrain violently restricted their lateral movement, compressing the heavy infantry between jagged rock faces and saturated marshland. The 9th Legion had walked blindly into a fatal geographic bottleneck, a claustrophobic killing zone where the rigid Roman cohort structure physically did not have the space to lock its shields, and where the tribes had been patiently waiting for them to arrive. The moment the vanguard pushed into the narrow, boggy defile, the geometric perfection of the Roman war machine fractured. Roman heavy infantry doctrine was predicated on the unbroken line. To survive, a legionary needed the shield of the man to his right, protecting his exposed side. In the constricted, uneven topography of the Highland Pass, expanding into standard fighting lines was a physical impossibility. The cohorts were forced to compress, their ranks buckling as men stumbled over submerged roots and sank into the acidic peat. This involuntary compression robbed the soldiers of the physical space required to draw their short swords or brace their heavy shields against an incoming charge. Compounding this structural failure was a sudden, drastic drop in visibility. A dense, chilling highland mist rolled through the pines, cutting line of sight down to a few dozen feet. The Roman chain of command was entirely dependent on a highly sophisticated system of visual and acoustic communication. Centurions directed their centuries by following the movements of the elevated standards, while broader tactical shifts were broadcast through the piercing blast of the brass horns. The thick fog swallowed the standards, while the dense, wet timber of the surrounding forest muffled the horns. Blinded and deafened, the command structure instantly dissolved. The 5,000 soldiers were no longer a unified army. They were isolated into dozens of disconnected pockets of men, none aware of what was happening to the cohort just a few hundred yards ahead or behind them. This fragmentation was the precise tactical scenario the Caledonian irregulars had engineered. The indigenous assault did not begin with a massive infantry charge, but with a highly decentralized, compartmentalized offensive. The tribal coalition understood that destroying the logistical tail would paralyze the head. They targeted the drafted oxen and the wooden carts first, physically barricading the narrow track with the wreckage of Rome's own supply train. Once the column was immobilized, the warbands infiltrated the wide gaps that had opened between the stalled wagons and the marching cohorts. They struck the column laterally, hitting the flanks where the heavy infantry was completely exposed. The tribesmen unleashed continuous, devastating volleys of light javelins and arrows from the elevated slopes, targeting the unarmored legs and faces of the struggling legionaries before retreating instantly into the gray mist. Desperate to survive the relentless missile fire, isolated Roman officers ordered their men into the testudo, the famous tortoise formation. On the paved streets of a besieged city or a flat plain, this interlocking roof of heavy wooden shields was virtually impenetrable. However, the testudo is a mechanical structure that demands perfect, synchronized footing. As the legionaries attempted to lock their shields overhead while standing in knee-deep mud and navigating steep, rocky inclines, the geometric integrity of the formation naturally collapsed. Gaps appeared in the armored shell, and the continuous rain of Caledonian projectiles systematically exploited these structural fractures, pinning men to the mire. Without the ability to maneuver, retreat, or counterattack, the rigid Roman units were subjected to severe, methodical attrition. The 60 pounds of iron plate that usually guaranteed a legionary's survival became a fatal anchor in the saturated earth. Exhaustion claimed the men, their muscles failing after hours of holding heavy shields at steep, awkward angles. Unit cohesion eventually evaporated, and the disciplined ranks broke apart into localized, chaotic skirmishes among the ancient pines. The Caledonian irregulars systematically dismantled the isolated pockets of heavy infantry, overwhelming them with local numerical superiority. Standing amidst the collapsing vanguard, unable to see the rear of his own column through the choking fog, the Roman commander absorbed the totality of the disaster. He faced a horrifying reality. It was not a single glorious battle they were losing, but a slow, agonizing bleed that offered no possibility of rescue and absolutely no chance of surrender. As the daylight faded into a thick, freezing dusk, the final isolated pockets of Roman heavy infantry were extinguished. Without centurions to anchor the defense and with their stamina entirely spent, the remaining legionaries were systematically cut down in the mire. The command structure of the 9th Legion collapsed completely, leaving the surviving men to fight desperate, leaderless skirmishes that ended in inevitable destruction. The most devastating psychological blow of the massacre occurred in the dying moments of the engagement, centered around the Legion's standard-bearer. The Aquila, the golden eagle that served as the sacred embodiment of the Ninth's honor and the literal soul of the unit, was violently wrenched from Roman hands. To the imperial government, the loss of an eagle was not merely a battlefield casualty. It was an absolute spiritual and political humiliation that struck at the core of Roman invincibility. The Caledonian tribes did not just defeat the 5,000 men of the Hispana. By capturing their standard, they effectively erased the legion's identity from the military pantheon. What makes the annihilation of the 9th Legion so deeply unsettling to modern historians is the absolute void of physical evidence left in its wake. When a Roman army fell on the continent, the victorious enemy or a subsequent imperial recovery expedition typically left behind mass graves, triumphant monuments, or vast scatters of battlefield debris. The northern Highlands, however, operated on a fundamentally different, brutal economy. Iron and bronze were commodities of immense practical value to the indigenous tribes, far more precious than gold or silver. In the immediate aftermath of the ambush, the Caledonian warriors meticulously stripped the 5,000 Roman corpses of their weapons, interlocking armor plates, and metallic fittings. The heavy lorica segmentata, shattered shields, and finely forged gladii were carried off into the deep woods to be repurposed or melted down into local weaponry. By claiming these spoils, the tribes removed the most enduring archaeological signatures of a Roman military presence from the site. With the metal scavenged and the dead stripped bare, the environment itself actively completed the total erasure of the 9th Legion. The Scottish landscape is heavily dominated by highly acidic peat bogs, a volatile topography that relentlessly breaks down calcium and organic matter. While dry desert sands or stable Mediterranean soil might preserve the skeletal remains of fallen soldiers for millennia, the dark, saturated earth of the Highland marshes quietly dissolved the unburied bodies of the Roman heavy infantry. The 5,000 veterans of Legio IX Hispana were not granted the dignity of a traditional funeral pyre or a marked tomb. They were simply swallowed by the hostile geography they had confidently marched out to conquer. As the mist settled back over the bloodied defile, a profound and heavy silence fell across the northern frontier. Miles to the south, behind the imposing stone walls of Eboracum, the remaining auxiliary garrison stood watch along the ramparts, scanning the empty horizon, waiting for a messenger who would never arrive. When weeks turned into months and the anticipated victory dispatches failed to materialize, the creeping dread at Eboracum hardened into absolute panic. The provincial administration faced a catastrophic reality. A premier military asset comprising 5,000 veteran heavy infantry had been completely erased, leaving the northern frontier dangerously exposed. For the Roman Empire, authority was entirely predicated on the projection of inevitable, overwhelming force. Acknowledging that an entire legion had been systematically dismantled by decentralized, undocumented tribesmen in the Highland bogs was not merely a military setback, it was an existential threat to the psychological dominance of Rome. If the conquered tribes in the south learned that the invincible imperial war machine could be shattered so thoroughly, the entire province of Britannia would inevitably erupt into a full-scale rebellion. Therefore, the imperial government initiated a ruthless campaign of political damage control. Instead of organizing public mourning or declaring a formal period of grief for the fallen soldiers of Legio IX Hispana, the state bureaucracy opted for absolute silence. The legion was subjected to a functional, military application of damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory. They were quietly and permanently struck from the official Roman army records. No replacement unit would ever be raised bearing the number 9 or the title Hispana. By administratively erasing the victims, the Senate and the military high command attempted to erase the defeat itself, ensuring that the horrifying tactical failure in the northern mist would not stain the broader, carefully curated myth of Roman invincibility. However, administrative fiction could not secure a porous physical border. The immediate tactical void left by the vanished infantry had to be plugged before the Caledonian insurrection could spill southward. Recognizing the severe instability of the British theater, the imperial apparatus executed a massive, continent-spanning logistical maneuver. Emperor Hadrian, intimately aware of the crisis, ordered the mobilization of Legio VI Victrix. These 5,000 fresh heavy infantry troops were pulled from their station in Germania Inferior, shipped across the Channel, and marched directly into the stone fortress at Eboracum to physically replace the ghosts of their predecessors. The rapid deployment of the 6th Legion successfully secured the immediate frontier, but it also brought a stark shift in strategic reality to the highest levels of imperial command. When Emperor Hadrian personally arrived in Britannia around 122 AD, he surveyed a landscape that had consumed Roman blood and silver for nearly a century without yielding pacification. The silent disappearance of the 9th Legion served as a grim, undeniable proof of concept that the rigid doctrines of Mediterranean warfare fundamentally broke against the hostile geography and asymmetric tactics of Caledonia. The era of relentless, aggressive expansion into the northern frontier had definitively ended in a bloody, undocumented catastrophe. This left the emperor facing the ultimate strategic dilemma. How does a hyper-aggressive, expansionist empire respond when it finally realizes a border cannot be conquered by the sword alone? Emperor Hadrian's answer to this crisis was not a renewed offensive, but an unprecedented admission of geographical defeat. Beginning in 122 AD, he ordered the construction of a continuous 73-mile barrier across the entire width of the island. Hadrian's Wall was a colossal, highly engineered structure of stone and turf, studded with heavily garrisoned mile castles, fortresses, and deep defensive trenches. Yet, this architectural marvel was not a symbol of imperial triumph. It was a physical monument to Roman trauma. By building the wall, the imperial government was formally acknowledging that the northern expanse could not be subdued by the standard application of heavy infantry. The empire's grand strategy had fundamentally broken in the Scottish mists, forcing Rome to transition definitively from endless, aggressive expansion to guarded, defensive containment. The psychological barrier of Caledonia had finally been made solid. To this day, the ultimate fate of Legio IX Hispana remains one of the most intensely debated mysteries in ancient military history. The traditional and most geographically consistent narrative points to the total annihilation of its 5,000 veteran infantrymen in the damp, freezing bogs of Britannia during the tribal uprisings of the early 2nd century AD. However, a competing faction of modern historians argues for a different operational trajectory. Pointing to a handful of scattered, ambiguously dated inscriptions found on the continent, these scholars hypothesize that the 9th was quietly withdrawn from Eboracum, transferred to the eastern frontier, and subsequently dismantled decades later in either Judea or Armenia. Yet, even within this academic debate, an undeniable historical reality persists. The 9th Legion abruptly and completely vanished from the British military record at the exact moment the Northern Highlands erupted in coordinated violence. The chilling silence surrounding their disappearance serves as a profound, enduring testament to the absolute limits of imperial power. Rome had conquered the entire Mediterranean basin, toppled ancient dynasties, and paved the known world with precise military roads. But its rigid combat doctrine eventually shattered against an unforgiving landscape and a decentralized, asymmetric enemy. The Caledonian tribes, leveraging their intimate knowledge of the fractured topography, proved that brutal terrain and localized indigenous resistance could outlast the finest Roman steel. The disappearance of the 9th Legion proved that while the legions could subjugate structured kingdoms, they could not conquer geography itself. The fog of the northern frontier simply swallowed them whole, leaving behind nothing but a heavily fortified wall and an enduring historical void. Subscribe to our channel to relive the great chapters of history together and uncover the truths buried beneath the ancient battlefields.